What would you do if your team betrayed you just when you were about to touch glory? How would you react if your own boss celebrated your defeat at your worst moment? What if the final message you left on the radio hid a whole truth that no one wanted to see? It all started with a perfect postcard. The majestic Yas Marina circuit dressed to the nines to crown the new world champion. The spotlights, the fireworks, the excited faces. The entire show was set up to celebrate the end of an unforgettable season. But amid the general euphoria, there was a completely different story unfolding away from the cameras, between the static of a radio frequency and the absolute silence of a devastated pilot. Oscar Piastri didn't just lose a title. He lost his place in his own team's narrative. Lando Norris, after a season of very high level, culminated his promotion with a third place in the race that was enough for him to win the world championship. A feat that, from the outside, seemed fair and deserved. But that same night, the data revealed a much more complex, uncomfortable, and emotionally devastating narrative for the other McLaren driver, Oscar Piastri. He had reached a 70-point lead over Norris with just 6 races remaining. He was even 104 points ahead of Max Verstappen. He led with authority, winning on circuits that required total control of the car: Bahrain, Monaco, Canada, the Netherlands. And yet he finished third in the championship. Same number of victories as the champion, but with a profoundly different outcome. The radio conversation after the checkered flag is already one of the most uncomfortable in McLaren's modern history. While Tom Stallard, his track engineer, attempted to maintain his composure and offer some comfort, the broadcast was abruptly interrupted by Zak Brown, the team's CEO. Instead of allowing Piastri to process the loss or receive the support he deserved, Brown burst in celebrating Norris' championship with enthusiasm and triumphant tone. He did it once, and then another one, without measuring the moment, without reading the context, and, above all, without showing a hint of sensitivity to the pain that his own technical structure had just inflicted. Stallard tried to contain the situation. He was clearly heard trying to interrupt Brown with an almost pleading tone. "Zach, we're only through a couple of turns here." It was not successful. The boss's voice prevailed. The celebration of one became the humiliation of the other. Not because of the words, but because of what they represented. Nico Rosberg, former world champion, was the first to light the debate. He did not hesitate to describe the moment as a shocking lack of empathy at the most devastating moment for a pilot. And he was right, because it wasn't just a communication error. It was the public confirmation of an internal dynamic that Piastri had already been feeling, an invisible but brutally real hierarchy. An institutional inclination towards Norris that was disguised as neutrality. A double discourse that the Australian could not confront openly, but that the language of the radio had exposed forcefully. That was the real beginning of the tragedy. It wasn't Abu Dhabi. It was the certainty that even in the most bitter defeat, the driver who supported the team for more than half a year did not deserve even 2 minutes of respect to breathe, to process, to close the chapter. At McLaren, euphoria has no room for the defeated. And that message, although it was never said in words, was shouted over the radio frequency louder than any official statement. The image was misleading. At the Italian Grand Prix, McLaren seemed to operate with surgical precision. But beneath the surface something broke. In a race marked by strategy, a slow 5.9-second pit stop temporarily ruined Lando Norris' track position. Piastri, faster, overtook him. But what came next was no celebration. It was a direct order from the wall: return the position. Not because of an illegal maneuver. Not for undue advantage. Simply because the other's mistake had to be corrected through another's sacrifice. And Piastri obeyed. But not without leaving a mark. His radio message was brief, dry, uncomfortable. Is a slow pit stop part of racing? He didn't need to say more. That phrase, full of sarcasm and frustration, was the first cry of dissatisfaction from a pilot who was beginning to see how the ground beneath his feet was crumbling. Monza's decision was not just a management error. It was the beginning of a cycle of internal disconnection. In the following days, Piastri acknowledged in interviews that this order left an emotional mark on him. On the Beyond the Grid podcast, he confessed that there were things in the lead-up that maybe weren't the most helpful. His language was diplomatic, but the message was clear. There was a growing tension between the idea of equality within the team and the reality of decisions that systematically left it in the background. And then came Azerbaijan. In Baku, what was a fracture became a collapse. Piastri crashed in qualifying. Then he repeated the mistake on the first lap of the race. He didn't just lose points. He lost his streak of 44 consecutive races total, an impressive record for such a young driver. The pressure, the emotional exhaustion, the feeling of accumulated injustice. Everything exploded. Jacques Villeneuve, always brutal in his analyses, was blunt. What we are seeing is a total collapse of Piastri. It started in Monza, it manifested itself in Baku, but it was already brewing before. He is not in the right place mentally. The worst thing is that the fall did not stop. It was a spiral. In Mexico, while Norris dominated with disconcerting comfort, Piastri seemed completely out of touch. His rhythm was erratic. Their radio communication minimal. Journalists began to notice his body language. Slumped shoulders, short answers, lost gaze. The driver who weeks ago shone as the future of McLaren was now a shadow of himself. Jenson Button explained it with surgical precision. When the pressure builds up and you feel like you have to do everything perfect, you tense up. And when you tense up, you stop being yourself. You lose confidence. You don't take risks, or you overdo it. And that's lethal at this level. In terms of points, the blow was brutal. In the last 6 races, Norris gained 58 points, transforming a deficit of 34 points into a lead of 24 entering the final round in Abu Dhabi. But statistics only tell part of the story. What truly devastated Piastri was the internal erosion. Feeling less supported, seeing how his performance was no longer enough to keep his place, knowing that even when he won, there were internal doubts. Strategic decisions began to lean towards the other side of the garage. Public statements were filled with praise for Norris. And while the team talked about balance, the Australian driver began to experience firsthand what it meant to be the undercover number 2 in a team that promised equality. Piastri's fall was not technical. His talent was still intact. It was psychological, emotional, human. And that's why it was so painful to witness. What happened in Monza was an order. What followed next was a consequence. But deep down it was all a sign. A warning that at McLaren equality was a slogan, not a reality. And the driver who once led the world championship with authority ended up consumed by the invisible cracks of a team that, without saying it openly, had already chosen its champion. Sometimes a speech is not necessary. A sigh is enough. A silence. A radio frequency interrupted at the most delicate moment. Because Oscar Piastri's final message in Abu Dhabi was not just what he said, it was what he could not say. It was a truth that burned under layers of diplomacy, under years of professional training where the pilot learns not to show weakness. But this time the breakup was inevitable, and it was heard live. When the checkered flag fell, the tension in the McLaren wall was electric. One of its pilots had achieved maximum glory. The other had witnessed his dream unravel before his eyes. Tom Stallard, Piastri engineer and one of the most respected men in the Woking establishment, tried to do the right thing. He opened the radio channel cautiously, searching for a decent way to contain the wound. But he couldn't even finish a sentence. Zach Brown interrupted. Twice. His tone euphoric. His priority is clear. Celebrate Norris championship. There was no room for tears on the other side of the garage. The narrative changed. From a duel of teammates to a story of emotional imbalance within one of the most emblematic teams in the championship. What happened in Abu Dhabi became an open wound. Not just for Piastri, but for McLaren's reputation as a fair and neutral team. And the wound was exposed at the worst possible time. In front of the world's eyes at the climax of a season that had already been intense, unpredictable and emotionally draining. That radio message, the one that was interrupted, now has a symbolic load. It represents the emotional fracture between a pilot and his environment. The invisible break between what is promised publicly and what is practiced internally. And the most serious thing, the feeling that it doesn't matter how much talent you have, how many victories you get or how many points you lead, if the team has already decided that someone else is the protagonist of its story. Piastri's silence was uncomfortable, but it was also necessary, because it forced everyone to look inward, to question how a driver who was destined to be a champion ended up being emotionally separated by the same structure that formed him. Now, the big unknown is the future. Can Piastri continue at McLaren after this break? Can a team rebuild trust once it has been destroyed at its driver's most vulnerable moment? And most disturbing, how many other radio messages, silenced or interrupted, hide truths that have not yet been revealed? Piastri delivered a masterful season for more than 3/4 of the schedule. He won on pure technical circuits. He dominated on tracks where only elite drivers shine. And yet, their season unraveled not because of a lack of speed, but because of the constant erosion of something no simulator can measure: morale. Do you think McLaren was fair to Piastri during the season? Leave us your opinion what you think about all this.